He built an empire that made senators tremble and lost everything to a child's drawing. A man who could buy silence, buy loyalty, buy entire governments, brought to his knees by 6 words written in crayon. Tonight, you'll watch Nathaniel Sterling discover that the most dangerous thing he ever did wasn't building a criminal empire. It was turning his back on the only people who loved him without wanting anything in return. If this story hits you somewhere real, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because this is only the beginning. The night Nathaniel Sterling lost his family, the champagne was still cold. That's the part nobody talks about. Not the photographers, not the gossip columns that ran the story for 2 weeks before moving on to the next wreckage. Not the handful of people who were there and saw everything and said nothing, because saying something to Nathaniel Sterling cost you things you couldn't get back. Nobody talked about the champagne, still cold, still fizzing in the crystal flutes, while Charlotte walked out of the front door of the Sterling estate with her son's hand wrapped inside hers and the sound of 800 people celebrating behind her like a wave she was drowning in. The estate sat on 12 acres above the Hudson. On a clear night, you could see the lights of Manhattan from the upper terrace. All those lit windows stacked on top of each other. All those people living their ordinary, invisible lives in the same city where Nathaniel Sterling had built something that couldn't be measured in floors or square footage. The Sterling Syndicate didn't have a headquarters. It had pressure points. It had favors and debts, and the kind of influence that doesn't get written into contracts because contracts leave paper, and paper leaves evidence, and Nathaniel had spent 20 years making sure there was no evidence of anything that actually mattered. The gala was his wife's idea originally. Charlotte had suggested the anniversary party 3 months before, sitting at the kitchen island in the private wing of the estate while Ethan drew at the table beside her, the boy's tongue pressed to the corner of his mouth the way it always was when he was concentrating. She'd said something like, "We never celebrate anything real, Nathaniel. We celebrate deals and acquisitions and opening nights. When did we last celebrate us?" And he'd looked up from his phone and said, "Fine, whatever you want," because that was the answer that ended the conversation fastest, and he had 2 calls waiting and a congressional liaison who needed managing before the week was out. He should have paid more attention to the word real. The party was exactly what Charlotte hadn't wanted. 800 guests when she'd imagined maybe 40. Security staff in every corner when she'd imagined privacy. Photographers from 3 different outlets when she'd imagined no cameras at all. Nathaniel had handed the planning to his events coordinator, and his events coordinator understood what Nathaniel Sterling's parties were supposed to look like. They were supposed to demonstrate power. The gala demonstrated power. It demonstrated it relentlessly, from the moment the first car arrived at the iron gates to the moment the last senator shook Nathaniel's hand and told him, "This was one hell of an evening, Nathaniel, one hell of an evening." Charlotte had worn a dress the color of deep water, blue so dark it was almost black, because she'd read somewhere that the wives of powerful men were supposed to wear red or ivory. She never wore what she was supposed to wear. That was one of the first things Nathaniel had loved about her, way back before he'd gotten too busy to notice what she wore at all. Ethan had been allowed to stay up past his bedtime specifically for the occasion. He was 6 years old, and the estate to him was mostly a series of enormous rooms that echoed when he ran in a backyard so large he'd once gotten genuinely lost in it for 20 minutes. He didn't understand what the party was for, exactly, but he understood that his father was at the center of it, which meant his father was present, and that was unusual enough to be exciting. He'd spent part of the afternoon making something. He'd taken the good-colored pencils, the expensive set Charlotte kept in the craft drawer, not the waxy school ones, and drawn the 3 of them. Himself, small, his mother, his father, standing together under a yellow sun with lines radiating outward like a child's shorthand for warmth. Across the bottom, in the careful block letters he'd been practicing, he'd written, "Dad, I saved you a place next to us." He folded the drawing into quarters and put it in the inside pocket of his small suit jacket, the one Charlotte had ironed twice because it kept wrinkling. The ballroom was loud and bright and overwhelming, and Charlotte kept one hand on Ethan's shoulder as they navigated the crowd, nodding to faces she half recognized, accepting glasses of sparkling water she didn't drink. Nathaniel was across the room, working the space the way he always worked rooms, moving from cluster to cluster with the particular fluid ease of a man who understood that every conversation was a transaction and every transaction could be made to look like friendship. Charlotte watched him and felt the familiar mixture of things she'd stopped naming, admiration and exhaustion, and something older and quieter underneath both of those that she wasn't ready to examine too closely on a party night. Then the doors opened again. She heard it before she saw it, a shift in the room's noise, a ripple, the specific quality of attention moving toward a single point, heads turning, cameras lifting. And then Victoria Hayes walked in, and the ballroom did what rooms always did when Victoria Hayes entered them. It reorganized itself around her. Nathaniel's former fiancée had been overseas for 4 years. London, mostly, and then somewhere in Southeast Asia. And then nobody was sure exactly where, because Victoria Hayes had a talent for disappearing that matched her talent for reappearing at the exact worst moment. She was tall, dark-haired, and moved with the confidence of someone who had never once in her life wondered whether she belonged in a room. She was wearing something red. Of course she was wearing something red. The photographers moved toward her like water flowing downhill. What happened next was not dramatic in the way that dramatic things usually are. Nathaniel didn't rush toward her. He didn't sweep her into his arms or make any declaration. He was simply close enough to the doors that when Victoria walked in and the crowd parted and the cameras swung and the moment required someone to respond, he was the one standing there. His expression shifted. Surprise. Genuine surprise. Because whatever Nathaniel Sterling was, he wasn't a man who manufactured his reactions. He'd never needed to. And then he stepped forward and said something, and she responded, and there were hands shaken or possibly clasped and cameras firing from 6 different angles, and it lasted maybe 40 seconds. 40 seconds. Charlotte watched it happen from across the ballroom. She wasn't close enough to hear what was said. She wasn't close enough to read anything definitive in his face. What she could see clearly through 150 people and 8 years of marriage and a very long night was the image. Her husband, in his black tuxedo, standing close to a woman in red, while cameras turned their reunion into something permanent. Ethan saw it too. He'd slipped free of Charlotte's hand when he spotted his father across the room. The instinct of a child who sees his parent and moves toward him the way objects move toward gravity, simple and unconsidered. He'd pushed his hand into his jacket pocket and felt the folded drawing there and started moving through the crowd, ducking around legs and servers and the trailing edges of long dresses. He was maybe 20 feet away when the photographers closed in around Nathaniel and Victoria. A cluster of bodies and equipment and flashing light, and Ethan stopped. He was 6. He understood the shape of the situation without the words for it. He stood there for a moment with his hand inside his pocket, holding his drawing, looking at his father's profile as Nathaniel spoke to the woman in red, and the cameras recorded all of it. Then someone bumped Ethan from behind, a server not watching where he was going, and Ethan stumbled and almost fell, and by the time he'd righted himself, he was turned around and his mother was there, her hand finding his shoulder, her voice saying his name quietly. He looked up at her. Charlotte's face was doing the thing it did when she was holding something very carefully, like the time she'd found a bird with a broken wing in the garden and carried it inside without letting Ethan see how badly it was hurt. Contained. Careful. Her jaw set in a way that meant the control was costing her something. She said, "Come on, baby, let's get your coat." He said, "But I didn't give him his picture." She said, "You can give it to him another time." There was a quality in her voice that Ethan recognized but couldn't name yet. He would learn the name for it later, when he was older and had his own experiences with loss and the specific quiet that surrounds a decision that's already been made. Right then he just knew that when his mother used that voice, you didn't argue. You went and got your coat. They left through a side entrance. Charlotte said a brief word to the head of household security, handed back the glass of sparkling water she'd been carrying for 40 minutes, and walked out into the cold night air with her son's hand in hers. The sound of the party followed them across the stone terrace, music and laughter, and 800 people who would talk about this evening for months. Then a door closed and the sound cut off, and there was only the wind off the river and their footsteps. In the car, Ethan held his drawing on his lap and didn't unfold it. Charlotte looked straight ahead and didn't cry until he was asleep. The drawing she found later, on the back seat, still folded into quarters. She didn't look at it. She put it in her bag and told herself she'd deal with it in the morning. And morning came, and she dealt with other things instead. And the drawing stayed in her bag for 2 days before she finally unfolded it and read what her 6-year-old son had written and had to sit down on the kitchen floor of the rented apartment where she was staying and breathe through it. "Dad, I saved you a place next to us." She folded it back up, carefully, along the original creases. The night Charlotte Sterling left her husband, the champagne was still cold, and nobody noticed she was gone until the following morning when the house manager found the master suite empty and Charlotte's car absent from the garage, and the only evidence that she'd been there at all was a photograph of the three of them on the bedside table, face down. Nathaniel noticed the photograph. He picked it up. He didn't turn it over. He had a breakfast meeting at 7 and a conference call at 9 and a situation developing in the Chicago operation that needed his personal attention. He put the photograph down on the bedside table again and got dressed and went to his meeting and told himself Charlotte would call. She didn't call. He waited 3 days before he did anything about it. That was the first of many mistakes. 3 years is a long time. Long enough for a 6-year-old to become a 9-year-old who helps his mother carry groceries up 2 flights of stairs to a walk-up apartment in Somerville, Massachusetts, and has learned not to mention his father to other kids at school because the explanation is too complicated and the questions that follow are worse. Long enough for a woman to build something modest and functional and genuinely her own in a city that doesn't know her name, where nobody clears the path when she walks through a room and nobody is watching to see who she talks to. Long enough for a man to accumulate so much power that the silence inside it becomes the loudest thing in his life. Nathaniel Sterling's empire had grown in 3 years the way empires grow when they're tended by someone with nothing else to tend. Sterling Global Holdings now controlled 19 legitimate corporations and underpinned 6 others that weren't legitimate in ways that would have interested certain federal agencies had those agencies been able to follow the money past the 4th or 5th layer of shell companies, which they hadn't managed yet. His political influence extended to 11 states. 3 sitting judges owed him favors significant enough that they'd stopped counting them. A shipping conglomerate in the Pacific Northwest, a pharmaceutical distribution network in the South, a private security firm with contracts in 4 countries, all of it organized, maintained, and growing under the Sterling name. The mansion above the Hudson was immaculate. The staff maintained it to the exact specifications Nathaniel had provided when he bought it, which meant every surface was clean and every room was ready, and the kitchen was stocked with food nobody ate. He had a chef he saw 3 times a week and a housekeeper he barely saw at all, and a rotating team of security personnel who kept the estate perimeter exactly as he'd designed it. Safe. Controlled. Empty. He slept in the master suite. He didn't move to a different room. He didn't redecorate. The photograph of the 3 of them was still on the bedside table. He'd turned it face up, finally, sometime in the 2nd year. He didn't know exactly when. One day, it was face down, and then at some point it wasn't, and he hadn't registered the moment of turning it over because the problem with small daily decisions is that you make them before you know you've made them. He had tried to find them. That was the other thing that nobody would have believed, that Nathaniel Sterling, who could find anyone who had assets and contacts and resources that dwarfed most government intelligence operations, had spent 8 months looking for his wife and son and found nothing. The trail had gone cold with a kind of deliberateness that he hadn't immediately recognized as deliberate, a forwarding address that led to a P.O. box that led to nothing. No credit cards in Charlotte's name, no employment records, a social security number that had, as far as any of his people could determine, simply stopped generating activity. He'd assumed in the beginning that she was staying with family, her sister in Atlanta maybe, or the college friend in Portland she'd mentioned once or twice. Both women had said, when asked, that they hadn't heard from Charlotte in months. He'd believed them because they looked frightened when they said it, and people who are lying to Nathaniel Sterling tend to show it somewhere in their bodies. And these women showed nothing except genuine worry. He'd hired investigators. The first 2 had come back with nothing useful. The third had disappeared. Not literally, not in any way that would have interested a missing persons unit, but the man had returned his retainer and declined to continue the investigation with the kind of carefully worded explanation that meant someone had gotten to him. Someone with enough leverage to make a professional investigator walk away from Nathaniel Sterling's money. That was the moment Nathaniel had stopped assuming this was Charlotte's choice and started wondering what else it was. The syndicate's internal structure had 3 tiers. The outer tier was entirely legitimate. Sterling Global's board members, corporate officers, legal counsel, They knew who they worked for, and they were paid extraordinarily well to not ask questions about where some of the capital flows originated. The middle tier was semi-insulated, people who did work that existed in gray areas, who understood the nature of the organization without being directly exposed to its operations. And then there was the inner circle, just 7 people, including Nathaniel, who knew everything, who had access to the full scope of what the Sterling Syndicate was and did and owned. Those 7 people knew that Charlotte and Ethan existed. 3 of those 7 people had the operational capacity to make a private investigator walk away from a case. Nathaniel had sat with this information for 2 years. He'd moved carefully, because moving carelessly inside his own organization at that level was how you ended up dead in a way that looked like an accident. He'd watched. He'd listened. He'd used assets the inner circle didn't know existed, because the first rule of intelligence work, which Nathaniel had learned before he was 30, was that you always kept something in reserve. What he'd found, gradually and then all at once, in the way that investigations collapse into clarity, was that someone had been managing his family's disappearance? Not Charlotte's choice to leave. That had been real, he was certain of it now. But everything after. The investigator who got spooked. The blank records. The security officer who'd reportedly told Charlotte when she returned to the estate the morning after the gala to speak to her husband that Mr. Sterling wasn't accepting visitors. That last one had hit him like something physical. He'd been sitting at his desk when he read the report, the careful account his most trusted investigator had finally assembled from 3 years of fragments. And he'd had to put the papers down and stand up and walk to the window and stand there with his hands pressed flat against the glass because the alternative was breaking something. Charlotte had come back. She'd come back the morning after the gala, and someone had turned her away. Someone had told his wife, standing at the gates of their own home with their 6-year-old son, that Nathaniel Sterling wasn't available, that he wasn't accepting visitors. His wife, described as a visitor at her own front door while he was inside conducting business, unaware she was there, would have gone to her immediately if he'd known, would have run if he'd needed to. Someone had kept them apart. Deliberately, for 3 years. The morning Nathaniel received that report, he cleared his schedule for the first time in 3 years. Completely. Every meeting, every call, every obligation. He handed it to his deputy and said handle it and didn't explain why. His assistant looked alarmed and he didn't reassure her. He drove himself, which he hadn't done in 2 years, out of the estate and into the city, and found himself parked outside a diner in the West Village that he and Charlotte had gone to on their 3rd date. It was a Tuesday morning and the place was half empty, and he sat at the counter and ordered black coffee and didn't drink it. He thought about a woman he'd loved walking up to the front gates of her own home and being told she wasn't welcome. He thought about a 6-year-old boy standing next to her, too young to understand but old enough to absorb the shape of rejection, the way children absorb everything, not in their minds but in their bodies, in some deeper place that doesn't use language. He left $40 on the counter for a $4 coffee and walked out. That was 6 weeks ago. Since then he'd moved quickly, for the first time in 3 years. His 4th investigator, the one who'd been running the background operation, the one nobody in the inner circle knew about, had finally produced what the previous 3 had not. Photographs. Recent ones. Charlotte at a farmer's market in Somerville, Massachusetts, in a light jacket, carrying reusable bags. Ethan walking beside her, taller than Nathaniel had been expecting, with a backpack and the slightly distracted look of a kid whose mind was elsewhere. They were fine. They were alive. They were, from what the investigator could determine, genuinely okay. Not happy in the complicated way that happiness is built, from what you actually have rather than what you're missing, but okay, functioning, building something. The photographs were 3 weeks old. Nathaniel had them printed and put one in the inside pocket of his suit jacket because that was where Ethan had kept his drawing, and he wasn't going to examine that impulse too carefully. Then the black SUVs started appearing. His investigator noticed them first. 2 vehicles, never the same plates twice, rotating through the neighborhood where Charlotte and Ethan lived. Patient, professional. The kind of surveillance that doesn't announce itself, which meant it was being run by someone who knew what they were doing. His investigator had flagged it, sent photographs of the vehicles, and then 11 hours later had sent a message that said, "I need to go dark. I'll be in touch," and hadn't been in touch since. The warning arrived 3 days after that. Unsigned. delivered through a channel that should have been secure, which meant that it wasn't, which meant that someone was demonstrating their access. The message was 7 words: "Stop looking. We found them before you did." Nathaniel had read the message 3 times. Then he'd picked up his phone and called Marcus Webb, the head of his private security team, one of the 7, inner circle, a man he'd trusted for 15 years, and said, "I need everything we have on Charlotte and Ethan's current location, and I need it now. No delays, no routing through anyone else, just you and me." And Marcus had said, "Of course," immediately, and 6 hours had passed without a callback, which was 6 hours too long. Nathaniel was still waiting when his assistant knocked on his office door at 8 in the evening and handed him a sealed envelope. No return address, hand-delivered to the front gate by a courier who'd left immediately and hadn't given a name. Inside the envelope was a single piece of paper. On it, printed in plain type: "Your son has a school event. Family Day. October 14th, Brookline Academy, Brookline, Massachusetts. Be there or spend the rest of your life wondering what they did to him when you didn't show up." October 14th was 11 days away. Nathaniel put the note down on his desk. He sat very still for a long moment. Outside his window, the lights of Manhattan went on doing what they always did: burning, relentless, indifferent to anything as small and specific as one man's particular species of hell. Then he picked up his phone and called the one number in it that existed outside any organizational structure, a number he'd memorized years ago and never written down. A number that belonged to a woman named Diane Reyes, who worked for a federal agency that had been trying to build a case against the Sterling Syndicate for going on 4 years. He'd maintained the channel as insurance, the way intelligent people maintain all their options. He'd never used it. He used it now. She picked up on the second ring. He said, "I have information you want, and I have a problem, and I think these 2 things are connected. And before you say anything, I need you to understand that there is a 9-year-old child in Brookline, Massachusetts, who is currently under surveillance by people inside my own organization, and October 14th is when they're going to move." Silence on the line. Then Diane Reyes said very carefully, "Tell me everything." Nathaniel told her. When he finished, she was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "We've been watching 3 of your people for 8 months. The connection to your family was the piece we were missing." He said, "It's not missing anymore." She said, "No, it's not." He said, "I need to be at that school." She said, "Sterling." He said, "I'm going to be at that school. You can work with that, or you can explain to your supervisor why you didn't." Another silence. Longer this time. Then Diane Reyes said, "Don't bring more than 2 people with you. And for the love of everything, don't tell anyone you're going. Not one person inside that organization." He said, "Understood." He hung up. He sat at his desk for a long time after that. The city lights outside kept burning. Somewhere in Brookline, Massachusetts, in an apartment 2 flights up, his son was probably asleep, the way 9-year-olds are asleep by 9 o'clock, deeply and completely, the way children sleep when they feel safe enough to let their guard down. He thought about that. He thought about Charlotte in the apartment below whatever ceiling Ethan was sleeping under, maybe reading, maybe not reading, maybe sitting in a kitchen with a cup of something warm and thinking about her own set of things that Nathaniel would probably never fully know. He thought about a drawing folded into quarters, a space saved beside a crayon mother and a crayon father who wasn't there yet. He opened his desk drawer. He took out the photograph his investigator had printed. Charlotte at the farmer's market, Ethan beside her, both of them ordinary and alive and unaware of the camera. He looked at it for a long time. He put it back in his jacket pocket, over his chest. Then Nathaniel Sterling, who had built an empire through intelligence and fear and the careful management of everything that could be managed, did something he hadn't done in years. He went home to the empty house above the Hudson and sat in the kitchen. Not his office, not the formal rooms, but the kitchen, because that was where Charlotte had been when she'd suggested they celebrate something real. And he stayed there until the sun came up, and he didn't make a single call, and he didn't manage a single thing, and he let the silence be exactly what it was. 11 days. Somewhere in the Sterling Syndicate's inner structure, someone who had orchestrated 3 years of separation was watching the same calendar and counting down to a different outcome. Someone who had turned away a woman at her own front gate and ordered the investigation buried and kept a father from his son for 1,000 days was now 11 days out from October 14th, making their final preparations. They believed Nathaniel didn't know. They were wrong about that. But they didn't know they were wrong yet, and in the 11 days between this kitchen and a school in Brookline, the difference between what they believed and what was actually true was going to matter more than anything else. The photograph was warm inside his jacket pocket. He thought, 11 days. He thought, hold on. Nathaniel drove to Boston himself. He took the Audi, not the armored Suburban, because the Suburban was logged and tracked and reported back to a dispatcher who reported to Marcus Webb. And Marcus Webb was currently occupying the top position on a very short list of people Nathaniel no longer trusted with his whereabouts. He took the Audi and he took two men, Croft and Ewan, both of whom had been with him for over a decade, and both of whom existed in his personal payroll, not the syndicate's. A distinction he'd maintained deliberately and which was now the most important decision he'd made in years. He told them where they were going and why, which was more than he usually told anyone, and neither of them asked questions, which was why they were the two men he'd chosen. They left the estate at 4 a.m. The highway was nearly empty. The sky above Connecticut was that particular shade of dark that comes just before it starts thinking about light. Not dawn, not night, but something suspended between the two. Nathaniel drove and didn't talk and kept his eyes on the road and tried not to calculate how many hours Ethan had been asleep and awake, and asleep again during the 3 years he'd spent looking in the wrong places. Croft rode shotgun. Ewan was in the back. Both men had weapons that weren't registered to anything connected to the Sterling Syndicate, because Nathaniel had anticipated needing exactly this, two armed men who didn't exist on any organizational chart. At some point, though he'd hoped the occasion would be different than this particular one. They reached the Somerville area at 7:15. Nathaniel had memorized the address from the investigator's report. He drove past it once without stopping, a 3-story brick building on a quiet residential street, corner unit on the second floor based on the window configuration in the surveillance photographs. A small coffee shop 2 blocks east, a park across the street with a few early morning dog walkers moving through the cold. Normal. Ordinary. The kind of block that doesn't announce itself. He parked on the far side of the park. Croft said, "What do you want to do?" Nathaniel said, "I want to watch." Croft didn't argue. He pulled out a thermos of coffee and poured a cup and didn't offer one to anyone else because he knew Nathaniel wouldn't take it, and Ewan was already tracking the street in the side mirror with the focused inattention of someone trained to surveil without looking like they were surveilling. They waited. At 7:42, the front door of the building opened and Ethan came out. Nathaniel's hands tightened on the wheel before he registered the intention to tighten them. The boy was taller than the photograph had suggested. He had his mother's jaw and Nathaniel's eyes, a combination that was somehow both obvious and startling in person, in motion, on a real child walking down real stairs with a real backpack over one shoulder and a look of mild morning resentment that was the most human expression Nathaniel had ever seen on anyone. Ethan stopped at the bottom of the steps and shifted the backpack on his shoulder and looked up at the sky for a moment. Gray, the promise of cold, and then looked back at the door he'd come out of. Charlotte appeared in the doorway. She was in a dark coat, her hair shorter than he remembered, a coffee travel mug in one hand and her bag over the other shoulder. She said something to Ethan, and Ethan said something back with the exaggerated weariness of a child who doesn't want to hear whatever he's being told. Charlotte pointed at his jacket. He zipped it. She nodded and came down the steps, and they started walking north along the sidewalk together, Ethan half a step ahead the way kids always are. Charlotte keeping pace without effort, and there was something in the ease of it, the thoughtless daily rhythm of two people who have been navigating each other's mornings for 3 years that landed somewhere in Nathaniel's chest with a weight he wasn't prepared for. He said nothing. Croft said quietly, "She looks okay." Nathaniel said, "I know." Ewan said, from the back, "Black SUV, north end of the block." It was there when we came through the first time. Nathaniel moved his eyes to the rear view without turning his head. The vehicle was parked 30 meters up the street. Dark, late model, no visible plates from this angle. The engine might have been running. It was hard to tell. He said, "Same plates?" Ewan said, "Different, but same model, same window tint, same antenna configuration on the roof. It's the same operation." Nathaniel watched Charlotte and Ethan reach the corner. They turned right. The SUV didn't move, but a figure inside it, driver's seat, barely visible through the tinted glass, shifted in a way that meant they were watching the same corner. Nathaniel said, "They're documenting the route." Croft said, "Or they're waiting for something." Nathaniel said, "Waiting for what?" Croft didn't answer because he didn't need to. They both knew what. You don't run long-term surveillance on a woman and a child and rotate your vehicles to avoid detection unless you're building toward something. Surveillance ends two ways. You get the information you need and you stop, or you get the order to move and you stop. Either outcome meant the passive phase was almost over. Nathaniel started the car. He drove back to the highway, and the three of them didn't talk until they'd cleared the city, and Ewan said, "We need to brief Reyes." Nathaniel said, "I already told Reyes everything she needs." Ewan said, "She needs to know the surveillance is active. She needs to know they've got eyes on the current location, not just the school." Nathaniel said, "I know what she needs." Silence. Then Croft said, carefully, "Nathaniel, talk to her." Nathaniel drove. The road was getting busier now, morning commute building up in the other direction, long rows of headlights heading south toward the city. He thought about the SUV sitting on Charlotte Street. He thought about the figure behind the tinted glass, patient and professional, documenting a woman's morning routine. He took out his phone and called Reyes. She picked up in 2 rings. He said, "The surveillance is active. They have at least one vehicle on her residential location. They've changed plates since the initial photographs, but Ewan confirmed same hardware configuration." Reyes said, "How close did you get?" He said, "Close enough." She said, "Sterling, I told you." He said, "I didn't approach them. I observed from a distance." A pause. Then, "How did she look?" He didn't answer for a moment. Then he said, "Fine. She looked fine." Reyes said, "Okay. We have a team we can put on the building, but if I move them into position now, it's going to register. These people are watching for exactly that kind of counter-surveillance response." He said, "So wait." She said, "So wait. And let me build toward the 14th in a way that doesn't spook them into moving early. If they think they've lost the element of surprise, they might escalate the timeline. And escalating the timeline means," he said, "means they move on my son before we're in position." She said, "Yes." He said, "How sure are you about the 3 names?" She said, 80% on 2 of them. The third is complicated." He said, "The third has a name." She said, "We think it's Webb." The word landed in the car like something dropped from a height. Croft looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel kept his eyes on the road. He said, "I've known Marcus Webb for 15 years. Reyes said, "I know." He said, "He ran security for my family. When Charlotte and Ethan were still at the estate, Webb's team was there." He stopped. Reyes said quietly, "I know, Nathaniel." He said, "He was the one who would have briefed the gate security 3 years ago when she came back." Reyes said nothing. The road went on. The commuter traffic built and eased and built again, and Nathaniel drove through all of it without registering any of it, because everything in his mind had narrowed to a single image. Charlotte at the front gates of the estate, Ethan beside her, and somewhere inside a guardhouse or an intercom or whatever interface they used, Marcus Webb's instructions being carried out. "Mr. Sterling isn't available. He's not accepting visitors." He said, "I want a meeting with Webb." Reyes said, "That is not He said, "I'm not asking for authorization." She said, "Sterling, if you confront Webb before the 14th, he will know we're onto him, and he will move the timeline, and your son will—" He said, "I'm not going to confront him." Silence. He said, "I need him to believe nothing has changed. I can do that. That's something I know how to do." A longer silence. Then Reyes said, "You have 11 days to hold it together." He said, "I've held it together for 3 years." She said, "That's not the same thing and you know it." He said nothing. She said, "Call me when you're back at the estate. And Sterling, don't go back to Somerville without telling me first." He hung up without agreeing to that last part. The meeting with Webb happened the following morning. Nathaniel requested it through normal channels, which meant it appeared on Webb's calendar as a routine security review, which happened periodically enough that it wouldn't register as unusual. Webb came to the estate at 10 a.m. He was 53, with the kind of compact physical economy that former military men carry into middle age. Not large, but dense, and careful about how he moved. He'd been with Nathaniel since the early years, back before the syndicate was what it was now, when it was smaller and more precarious, and the relationships inside it were forged under the kind of pressure that normally produces loyalty. Nathaniel had been wrong before about what kinds of pressure produced what kinds of things. They sat in the study. Nathaniel had coffee brought in and poured 2 cups himself, which was unusual enough that he saw Webb register it, a brief flicker of attention in the man's eyes before his face resettled. Nathaniel handed him the cup and sat down across from him and talked for 20 minutes about the state of the Eastern operations, a distribution problem in Philadelphia, some personnel issues in the legal department, the kind of ordinary organizational maintenance that filled their routine meetings. He watched Webb's face while he talked. Webb listened, contributed where appropriate, made 2 suggestions that were both operationally sound and gave no indication of anything except professional engagement. He was good. Webb was genuinely good, and Nathaniel felt something cold move through him at the confirmation of it, because goodness at deception wasn't a neutral skill. You practiced it. You practiced it on people you knew, over time, until it became the default surface you presented. Nathaniel said, "I got a report this week about a surveillance operation in Boston. Unaffiliated. Someone running eyes on a residential location that's adjacent to one of our holding interests up there." Webb said, "Which location?" Nathaniel named a holding that didn't exist. He watched Webb's face. Webb said, "I'm not aware of anything adjacent. I can pull the file." Nathaniel said, "Do that." Webb said, "You think it's a competitor operation?" Nathaniel said, "Could be. Could be federal. Could be someone trying to map our Boston connections. I want to know who's running it." Webb said, "Understood. I'll have something for you by end of week." Nathaniel nodded. He picked up his coffee cup. He said, "I also want a full security review of the intercommunications infrastructure, the encryption protocols." Webb said, "We ran one 6 months ago." Nathaniel said, "Run another one." Webb studied him for a moment. Not long. 2 seconds, maybe 3. The kind of look that contained a question he'd decided not to ask. Then he said, "Of course." After Webb left, Nathaniel sat in the study for a long time without moving. The fire in the grate had burned down to a low orange pulse. Outside the windows, the estate grounds were gray and cold, the trees stripped of leaves, the paths empty. He thought about 15 years. He thought about the specific quality of trust that comes from shared risk, the way danger makes relationships feel permanent, makes you believe you know someone because you've seen them under pressure. He thought about Charlotte at the gate. He thought 15 years. And you did that. He thought, what does a man do with 15 years after something like that? He didn't have an answer. He suspected there wasn't one worth having. The days moved. Each one was a version of the same performance. Nathaniel at the center of the operation, attending to the ordinary machinery of the empire, conducting himself as a man with no private agenda and no emotional weather, while underneath all of it something was building that he didn't have language for. Not anger, exactly. Not grief. Something more structural, like a weight-bearing element under stress, too fundamental to name until the moment it fails. He called Reyes every other day. She reported that the federal operation was on schedule, that the surveillance on Charlotte's building had been quietly picked up by one of her team's assets, and that Webb and the 2 others, Harmon, the CFO's deputy, and a woman named Solano, who ran the syndicate's communications infrastructure, had been in contact with each other through a channel outside the normal organizational system. This was now documented. Reyes said, "We have enough to move on them after the 14th. We need them at the school." Nathaniel said, "They'll be at the school." She said, "You sound certain." He said, "They've invested 3 years in this. They're not going to miss the return on that investment." She said, "Nathaniel, I need to ask you something." He said, "Ask." She said, "When you see Charlotte at the school, what's your plan?" He said, "There is no plan for that part." She said, "That's what I was afraid of." He said, "I'm going to walk up to her and tell her the truth." Reyes said, "Which truth?" He said, "All of it. That someone blocked her at the gate, that I didn't know, that I've been looking, that I—" He stopped. Reyes waited. He said, "That I should have looked harder and faster." Reyes said quietly, "She's going to need time to process that, Nathaniel. You can't walk up to her in the middle of a school event with armed federal agents in position and—" He said, "I know. I know what I can and can't do. I just need to be there. She said, I know you do. On the evening of October 13th, Nathaniel was alone in his study when the message came through on his personal phone. Not a call, a text from a number he didn't recognize. 4 words. She knows you're coming. He stared at the message for 30 seconds. Then he called Croft and said, Get Ewan. We leave at 5. Croft said, What happened? Nathaniel said, Someone told Charlotte I'm going to be at the school tomorrow. Silence. Then Croft said, How? Nathaniel said, Because the people who've been running this for 3 years have had access to everything inside this operation, including my communications, and I've been talking to Reyes on my personal phone like an amateur. Croft said, Does Reyes know? Nathaniel said, She will in 30 seconds. He called Reyes. She picked up, and he read her the message, and there was a silence on her end that told him she'd already been reaching for her own phone when he called. She said, It could be a provocation. Could be designed to make you move tonight, make you go to the apartment tonight, make you do something that collapses the operation before the 14th. He said, Or it's designed to make Charlotte run. Another silence, longer. She said, I'm calling the asset on the building. He said, Call them now. He held on while she made the other call. He could hear fragments of a conversation, her voice clipped and operational. Then she came back and said, The building is still, no movement. SUV is gone. They pulled it 2 hours ago, which is... She stopped. He said, Which is what? She said, Which is consistent with someone who knows the next phase starts tomorrow and doesn't need the surveillance vehicle anymore. The room was very quiet. He said, They're going to move at the school. She said, Yes. He said, They were always going to move at the school. She said, Yes, Nathaniel. That's what the 14th was always for. That's why they sent you the note. They wanted you there. The understanding of it moved through him slowly and then all at once, the way cold water enters a room. They hadn't sent the note to warn him. They'd sent it to position him. Get Nathaniel to the school. Get Charlotte and Ethan to the school. Get the target and the leverage point in the same location with the man whose organization they were trying to seize, and then demonstrate, in the most direct way possible, that they had the ability to take everything from him that he hadn't already lost. Use his son to break him. Use his son to hand over the syndicate. 3 years of patience ending in one morning at a school in Brookline, while parents took photographs and children wore name tags, and the whole ordinary machinery of a family day ground forward around something that had nothing to do with families. He said, Reyes. She said, I'm here. He said, How many people can you have in position by 8 a.m.? She said, Enough. He said, That's not an answer. She said, It's the only answer I have right now. Nathaniel, you understand that if you show up at that school tomorrow, you are walking into exactly what they want. He said, I know. She said, And you're going. He said, My son is going to be there. A long pause. Then Reyes said, Okay, 5 a.m. call. Don't be late. He said, I won't. He put the phone down. He stood at the window of his study and looked out at the estate grounds in the dark. The trees were bare. The paths were empty. The whole enormous property, 12 acres and 17 rooms and more security infrastructure than most embassies, felt like exactly what it was. A container for a life that had already left. Tomorrow. Brookline. A school. His son, 9 years old, carrying a backpack through a morning he didn't know was the end of 3 years of someone else's careful plan. Nathaniel picked up his jacket. The photograph was still in the inside pocket, warm from where it had been sitting against his chest. He didn't take it out. He didn't need to look at it. He thought, tomorrow I find out what I'm made of, after everything. He thought, I already know what I'm made of. The question is whether it's enough. He turned off the light and walked out of the study and went upstairs to the bedroom that still had a photograph on the bedside table. Face up now. 3 people standing together in a garden that was part of a life he'd been slowly understanding for 3 years that he'd taken. He didn't sleep. He lay on top of the bedside covers in his clothes and watched the ceiling go from black to gray to the particular flat white of a New England October dawn, filtering through curtains he'd never once opened in 3 years of sleeping in this room alone. At 4:15, he got up and went to the bathroom and ran cold water over his face and looked at himself in the mirror for longer than he usually allowed. The face looking back at him was recognizable, but barely. Not because of age, though 3 years had done what 3 years does, but because of something behind the eyes. Some quality of a man who has been managing distance from himself for so long that the distance had become architectural, built into the structure of how he carried his head and held his jaw and kept his voice level in rooms where other men lost their composure. He thought, "Today that ends." He didn't know exactly what he meant by it. He got dressed anyway. Croft and Ewan were in the kitchen when he came downstairs. Croft had made coffee. Ewan had a tablet open on the counter with a satellite view of Brookline Academy pulled up, the school's footprint annotated with entry points, and the surrounding street grid. Neither man said good morning. Nathaniel poured coffee and stood beside Ewan and looked at the map. Ewan said, "Reyes has 4 vehicles staged here and here. Plain clothes, parents cover. 2 of them already have children enrolled at the school through the operations logistics. She has 2 more units on the perimeter roads and a tactical team on standby 3 blocks north." Nathaniel said, "How many?" Ewan said, "She told me 17 ground assets, not counting the tactical unit." Nathaniel said, "And Webb?" Ewan said, "No movement at Webb's residence overnight. He left at 6:15 this morning. Reyes has a tail on him." Nathaniel drank his coffee. It tasted like nothing. He said, "Harmon and Solano." Ewan said, "Harmon flew to Boston last night, private, filed a flight plan to a regional airport 40 minutes south of the city. Solano drove up yesterday afternoon and hasn't been located since." Nathaniel said, "She went dark." Ewan said, "Reyes thinks she's already in position, pre-staged, somewhere near the school." The 3 of them were quiet for a moment. Outside, the estate grounds were still dark, the trees black shapes against a sky that hadn't fully committed to morning yet. Croft said, "You should eat something." Nathaniel said, "I'm fine." Croft said, "I know you're fine. You should eat something anyway." Nathaniel looked at him. Croft was 61 years old and had been with him since Nathaniel was 32, and the syndicate was a smaller and more honest kind of dangerous operation, and the 2 of them had spent 3 nights in a parking garage in Baltimore once, waiting out a situation that had required waiting, and Croft had said the same thing then. You should eat something. Not because food was the point, because being the kind of person who eats before something hard is a small commitment to coming out the other side of it. Nathaniel opened the refrigerator. He took out bread and put 2 pieces in the toaster and stood there watching them. They left the estate at 5:45. The highway was quiet. Nathaniel rode in the back this time, Croft driving, Ewan beside him, and he watched the dark Massachusetts landscape move past the windows and thought about the call he'd had with Reyes at 5 a.m. She'd been clinical, operational, the version of herself she deployed when the situation had passed. The point where emotion was useful. She'd walked him through the staging, the communication protocols, the extraction plan for Charlotte and Ethan in the event that things moved before federal assets could contain the scene. She'd said, "The priority is the boy. Everything else is secondary." He'd said, "I know." She'd said, "Nathaniel, I mean everything." He'd said, "I know what you mean." What she meant was, if it came to a choice between the federal operation and his son's safety, she'd blow the operation. And if it came to a choice between Nathaniel's exposure and his son's safety, she'd expose him. He'd built something that warranted federal investigation for the better part of a decade, and the only reason he was being extended the particular courtesy of a coordinated response rather than an arrest was because Reyes was practical and the syndicate's inner circle was a bigger case than Nathaniel alone, and he'd offered something they needed. He understood the transaction. He'd been the one to initiate it. He thought about Charlotte seeing him at the school. He thought about the specific quality of seeing someone you've been trying not to think about, the way the body responds before the mind catches up, the involuntary recalibration, 3 years of built distance collapsing in the time it takes to register a face. He thought, she might turn around. She might take Ethan and leave. He thought, I can't let her do that. Not today. He thought, and I cannot tell her why she can't leave without telling her everything, and telling her everything in the middle of a school campus is not how she deserves to hear it. There was no version of this morning that wasn't going to cost something. They reached Brookline at 7:40. The school didn't open for Family Day until 8:30, but the parking areas were already beginning to fill, parents arriving early, the specific eager punctuality of people who had taken time off work for this. The campus was a converted Victorian building with modern additions on two sides, brick and glass, a wide front lawn with banner signage for the event, streamers in the school colors, a table near the entrance with a check-in station, ordinary. Nathaniel had Croft park 3 streets over. He sat in the back seat and watched the school's main entrance through Ewan's binoculars. At 8:05, Reyes called. She said, "Webb just parked on Garrison Street, west entrance. He's alone in the vehicle, but he's had his phone active for the last 40 minutes, and our intercept shows 3 different outgoing contacts in the last hour." Nathaniel said, "Harmon and Solano." She said, "And a 4th number we haven't been able to identify. It's clean, no records, no registration. It's a burner that's been in contact with Webb's operational phone twice in the last week." Nathaniel said, "Local?" She said, "The cell ping puts it within 2 miles of the school, right now." He said, "One of their people is already inside." She said, "That's our read." He said, "Reyes, how confident are you in your asset placement?" She said, "Very." He said, "That's not a number." She said, "Confident enough that I'm not pulling you out." He said, "Okay." She said, "Charlotte Sterling's vehicle just turned onto the school's main access road. She's 2 minutes out." His hand tightened on the phone. He said, "I'm moving." She said, "Wait for my signal, Nathaniel. That was the..." He said, "Call me when Webb moves." "That's the signal." He got out of the car. Croft said his name. Nathaniel said, "Stay with the vehicle. Ewan with me." If Croft hears from Reyes that something has moved up, he was to get to the east entrance and make noise, the kind of noise that scattered civilians, because the worst thing in this particular situation would be bystanders in fixed positions. Croft said, "Understood." Nathaniel and Ewan walked toward the school. They were dressed plainly, Nathaniel in a dark jacket, no tie, the kind of clothes a father might wear to a school event if the father were someone who existed in a register of ordinary life. He didn't have his usual security posture, the slight geometric arrangement of men around him that announced something about the person at the center. He was just a man walking toward a school on a cold October morning, and nobody on the sidewalk looked at him twice. And this was both a relief and a strangeness he hadn't anticipated. How easy it was to be invisible when you moved without the apparatus of power around you. They were 40 meters from the entrance when Nathaniel saw Charlotte. She was at the check-in table signing something, Ethan beside her with his backpack and the particular physical impatience of a child who wants to get inside and find his friends. She was wearing a gray coat. Her hair was pulled back. She hadn't seen him yet. He stopped walking. Ewan stopped beside him. He watched his wife sign a form at a table and hand the pen back to the volunteer and straighten up and say something to Ethan that made the boy roll his eyes in that specific performative way that meant he was suppressing a smile. She put her hand briefly on the back of his neck. Not a correction, not direction, just contact, the kind of casual, physical reassurance that long familiarity produces, and they moved toward the building's entrance together. She turned once at the door to check something in her bag. Her eyes swept the front lawn. They found him. The 40 meters between them disappeared in some way that wasn't physical. She went absolutely still. He watched it happen. The arrest of motion, the recalibration, the 3 years of built distance collapsing exactly the way he'd imagined it, except that he hadn't imagined being the one standing still while it happened. He'd imagined moving toward her, but now he was rooted to the cold ground because her face was doing something he couldn't read from 40 meters, and he needed to read it before he moved. Ethan, half inside the door already, turned back to see why his mother had stopped. He looked at the lawn. He looked at the man standing on it. He didn't recognize his father. That was the thing that moved through Nathaniel's chest like a physical force. His 9-year-old son looked at him and didn't know him. 3 years. He'd been 6. Nathaniel had been away before that too. Even when he was present, he'd been away. And the man standing on the school lawn in a dark jacket was a stranger to the boy who had once folded a drawing into quarters and put it in his suit jacket and tried to push through a crowd of photographers to deliver it. Charlotte said something to Ethan. Nathaniel couldn't hear it. Ethan looked at her, then back at the lawn, then back at her. She put her hand on his shoulder and they went inside. She didn't come back out. Nathaniel stood on the lawn for another 5 seconds. Then Ewan said very quietly, "His phone is moving. Webb is moving." Nathaniel's phone buzzed. Reyes. Webb entering the building. East Wing, moving fast for a school event. He started walking. The inside of the school smelled like floor wax and construction paper and the particular warm-over radiator smell of old buildings in October. The Family Day event had distributed itself through the ground floor. Classrooms with doors open, art projects on display, a gymnasium at the far end with tables and refreshments, and the low roar of a crowd in an echoing space. Parents and children moved through the corridors in clusters. Nathaniel moved against the flow, Ewan 3 steps behind, scanning. He found Charlotte in the 3rd classroom on the left. She was standing near the window, looking at a display of student projects on the wall. Ethan's, presumably, from the way she was positioned in front of it. Ethan himself was across the room talking to 2 other kids with the animated ease of children who are primarily interested in each other and only marginally interested in parents. Nathaniel came through the door. Charlotte turned. Up close, 3 years up close instead of 40 meters across a lawn, her face was the same face, and also not sharper, maybe, or more certain, the particular quality of a woman who had been making all her own decisions for 3 years and had gotten competent at it. She looked at him the way you look at someone you've been bracing for. She said, "I know you'd be here." He said, "I know you know." She said, "Someone sent me a message." He said, "I know about the message." She said, "Nathaniel." He said, "Charlotte, I need you to listen to me, and I need you to do it quickly, and I need you to not react in a way that draws attention to us." She said, "Don't do that. Don't give me instructions." He said, "Please, I'm asking you, not telling you. Please listen." She looked at him for a long moment. The room moved around them. Children's voices, a teacher explaining something in the corridor, footsteps. She said, "You have 2 minutes." He talked. He told her about the investigation, the investigator who went dark, the report that someone had ordered the gate security to turn her away, the 3 names. Webb. He watched her face while he talked and watched it change in ways that she couldn't fully control. Anger, first, which he expected, and then something underneath the anger that was more complicated and more devastating. The specific expression of someone absorbing information that retroactively reshapes 3 years of the story they've been telling themselves about why things are the way they are. She said, "Marcus Webb told them to turn me away." He said, "Yes." She said, "I stood at that gate for 2 hours." He said, "I know." She said, "Ethan was with me. He was 6 years old and I was standing there for 2 hours, and your people told me you wouldn't." She stopped, looked away. The window. Outside, the school lawn, the banner in the school colors, an ordinary morning. He said, "Charlotte." She said, "Don't." He said, "I have to tell you the rest. There's more and it matters right now, today, in this building." She turned back to him. Her jaw was set in that way he remembered, the way that meant she was holding something carefully because the alternative was letting it break everything in reach. He told her about the surveillance, the SUVs, the note about Family Day. The 4th number on Webb's phone that morning, 2 miles from the school, a burner, unidentified. He told her that federal assets were in the building and that when he stopped talking, she needed to find Ethan and stay in this room and not move toward the exits regardless of what she heard. She said, "What am I going to hear?" He said, "I don't know exactly." She said, "That's not an answer." He said, "It's the only honest one I have." A silence. Then she said, "You're telling me my son is in danger, right now, in this building." He said, "I'm telling you federal agents are in this building and I'm going to make sure nothing happens to him." She said, "You're going to make sure?" He said, "Yes." She looked at him. The look lasted long enough to contain a great many things he didn't have the language for, and she probably didn't either. 3 years of absence and a gate and a drawing on the back seat of a car and whatever this morning was, whatever it was becoming. She said, "He's at the back table." He said, "Don't let him out of your sight." He turned to go. She said, "Nathaniel." He turned back. She said, "Come back." 2 words. The weight of them was disproportionate. He nodded once and went into the corridor and found Ewan and said, "Where's Webb?" Ewan said, "East Wing, stairwell." He went up. "There's nothing on the 2nd floor scheduled for today. It's administrative offices, all closed." Nathaniel said, He's meeting someone up there. Ewan's phone buzzed. He read it and looked at Nathaniel and said, Reyes says Harmon just entered through the service entrance on the south side. Staff lanyard. Fake. Her people are moving to intercept. Nathaniel said, and Solano. Ewan said, still unlocated. Nathaniel said, she's the fourth number. She's the one already inside. She's been inside since before we got here. Ewan said, where? Nathaniel said, somewhere close to the gymnasium. That's where the kids are concentrated. That's where you go if your objective is a child. They moved. The corridor to the gymnasium was busy. Parents moving in and out, children with paper name tags, a volunteer with a clipboard. Nathaniel moved through it with Ewan behind him and his phone to his ear, calling Reyes, who picked up and said, Harmon is contained. East entrance. 2 of my people have him. He's not going to make noise because he knows how this ends if he makes noise. Webb is still in the stairwell. We have 2 on him. Nathaniel said, Solano is near the gymnasium. Reyes said, how do you... He said, because that's where Ethan is, and this whole operation was always about Ethan, and Solano is the one who planned it, not Webb. Webb is a functionary. Solano is the architect, and she is currently inside this building somewhere near my son. A pause. Long enough to mean she was recalculating. She said, describe her. He said, 50, dark hair, medium height. She'll be in something that allows her to move. She'll have a lanyard. She'll look completely unremarkable. Reyes said, I'm pulling my people toward the gymnasium. He said, do it now. He pushed through the gymnasium door. The room was loud and bright, round tables with parents and children, a refreshment line along the east wall, a small stage at the far end with a banner. 200 people, maybe more. Nathaniel stopped inside the door and scanned. Ewan beside him. Both of them still, reading the room. He found Ethan first, at a table near the center beside a kid with a red backpack, and the relief of locating him was physical and involuntary, a loosening of something that had been rigid since 5 a.m. Then Ewan grabbed his arm. He said, 12 o'clock. Woman at the refreshment table. Dark lanyard. She's been watching the center of the room since we came in and she hasn't moved. Nathaniel looked. He recognized Elena Solano in the same moment that Elena Solano recognized him. She was holding a coffee cup she wasn't drinking. She was 48 feet from Ethan's table. She was not alone. Behind her, near the stage exit, a man in a catering uniform had gone very still in the specific way that men go still when they are receiving a signal. Their eyes met across the gymnasium, and Elena Solano smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who has been patient for a very long time and has arrived, finally, at the moment all that patience was for, and who wants the other person to understand that the patience has been the point, that the waiting itself was a form of power, that 3 years of quiet, careful management of someone else's life was always going to end here, in this room, with this particular arrangement of people and proximity and leverage, she said, across the distance between them, not loudly, but clearly. You should have stayed in New York, Nathaniel. And the man in the catering uniform near the stage exit reached into the cart beside him, and the gymnasium door behind Nathaniel crashed open, and someone screamed, and the ordinary machinery of Family Day. The scream came from the left, and Nathaniel was already moving before it finished. Not toward the exit, toward the center of the room, toward Ethan's table. The gymnasium exploded into the particular chaos that happens when 200 people in a confined space simultaneously understand that something is wrong but haven't yet processed what. Chairs scraped. A table went over. Children's voices shifted from noise to a higher, more urgent register, and parents responded to that register the way parents do, instinctively, reaching for their kids, pulling them close, not yet running because the mind hadn't caught up to the body's knowledge. Nathaniel moved through all of it like water finding the lowest point, not fast in a way that was visible, but direct, without hesitation, threading between bodies with the focused economy of a man who had rehearsed scenarios like this in his mind for 30 years. The man in the catering uniform near the stage exit had the cart open. What he was reaching for was not a weapon yet, not visible, not presented, but his body was oriented wrong for the space, wrong for the event, angled toward the crowd in a way that had nothing to do with refreshments, and Ewan had already identified him and was already moving on an intercept line that would arrive before the man's hand cleared the cart. Nathaniel's eyes found Ethan. The boy was standing. He'd pushed his chair back when the scream happened and was on his feet with the instinctive alertness of a child who is absorbed, Through 9 years of proximity to a mother who is always quietly prepared, that when something sounds wrong, you stand up and you look for her. He was looking for Charlotte. He hadn't found her yet because Charlotte was across the gymnasium, already moving toward him, already in motion, and the distance between them was maybe 60 feet in closing, 30 feet from Nathaniel. Still reachable. Then Elena Solano stepped between him and the boy. She'd moved fast for someone who'd been standing still. She was at the edge of Ethan's table now, close enough to touch him, and the coffee cup she'd been holding was gone, and her left hand was empty. And what her right hand held was not large, but was definitive. A compact black device, handheld, the kind that requires proximity and is not technically a firearm, but communicates the same basic message to everyone in range, which was, I am in control of the immediate future. She said to the room, not loudly, with a quality of voice that carried precisely because it was so controlled. Everybody stop. The gymnasium stopped. Not completely. Children whimpered. Someone near the back wall was saying something in a low, continuous voice that was either prayer or panic. But the mass movement arrested, the way a crowd arrests when it encounters something it can't route around, and 200 people in a school gymnasium on a Tuesday morning understood, collectively and very suddenly, that this was not a fire drill. Solano looked at Nathaniel. She said, I told you to stay in New York. He said, You told me to come here. She tilted her head. A fraction. The smile again, smaller this time, more private. She said, I told you where to be. You decided to come. That distinction matters. Nathaniel was still moving, slowly now, but still moving, because stopping entirely was a concession, and he wasn't making concessions. Not to her, not today. Each step was measured and visible, no deception in it, hands slightly away from his body, the body language of someone who is being transparent about their approach, because the transparency itself was a form of argument. I am not hiding what I'm doing. I am coming toward my son. Make of that what you will. He said, It's over, Elena. She said, It's really not. He said, Harmon is in federal custody. Webb is contained. The people you staged outside this building are being identified right now by agents who've been building this case for 8 months. Something moved through her face at Harmon's name. A compression around the eyes. Gone in a moment, controlled back under, but he'd seen it, and they both knew it. She said, You've been talking to Reyes, he said, for 6 weeks. She said, That's a significant breach of organizational protocol. He said, Elena, look around this room. There are children on the floor, school children, and their parents, and a teacher over there who's been trying not to cry for the last 90 seconds. This is where you chose to do this. She said, You chose this location, Nathaniel. You chose to bring a federal investigation into a building full of children. I simply arranged the timing. He took another step. She didn't move, but her right hand shifted slightly, a micro adjustment that meant she'd registered the step and she was recalibrating the distance. He said, How long? She said, How long what? He said, How long have you been planning to take the syndicate? A pause. She seemed to be deciding something, how much to say, whether it mattered now. Then she said, Since the night of your anniversary gala, 3 years ago. He said, That long. She said, You made a structural error, Nathaniel. You allowed sentiment to coexist with operation, a wife, a child. Inside the perimeter of the organization, sentiment is leverage, and leverage in the wrong hands is a weapon. I identified the weapon. I waited for the right moment to pick it up. He said, You separated me from my family for 3 years. She said, I removed a liability from an operation and kept the leverage accessible for future use. That's not personal. That's management. Something moved through Nathaniel's chest that was not anger, not exactly. Anger was too clean for what it was. It was the specific sensation of understanding something completely, fully, all the way to its structure, and finding that understanding intolerable in a way that had nowhere to go. 3 years. A drawing in a back seat. A woman waiting at a gate for 2 hours with her 6-year-old son. Management. He said, Where are your people outside? She said, They're where they need to be. He said, Reyes has 17 ground assets. She said, I have 11, and mine are already in position. And the difference between your federal friends and my people is that my people don't have to worry about rules of engagement. Ethan was 2 meters behind her. He was completely still, not frozen, but stilled, the way children go still when they understand that the adults around them are doing something that requires the children to be very small and very quiet. His eyes were on his mother, who was 15 feet away, and had stopped moving because Solano's right hand had moved again when Charlotte moved. A clear communication. Ethan's eyes moved to Nathaniel. He looked at this man he hadn't recognized on the lawn, this stranger in a dark jacket who had appeared in his mother's classroom and was now standing in his school gymnasium talking to a woman who was frightening adults. And Nathaniel watched his son look at him and try to work out who he was. Nathaniel said, "Ethan." The boy's eyes sharpened. Something in the voice, maybe. Something in the way his name sounded in that particular voice. Nathaniel said, "My name is Nathaniel Sterling. I'm your father. I know that doesn't mean much right now. You don't have to do anything with that information except hold on to it, okay?" Ethan looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once. Small. Solano said, touching. Nathaniel looked back at her. He said, "You're not getting out of this building with my son." She said, "I'm not trying to get out of the building with your son. I'm trying to get out of the building with your signature." Digitally executed. There's a device in the cart your friend has been trying to reach for the last 4 minutes that contains the relevant documents. Transfer of controlling interest in 12 of the 16 Sterling global entities to a holding structure I've been preparing for 18 months. You sign, I walk out, your son goes home, and the federal people outside get to write a very interesting report about the morning's events. He said, "And if I don't sign?" She said, "Then we find out whether federal response time is faster than my people's willingness to make this very complicated." He said, "You'd hurt a child." She said, "I'd create a situation in which outcomes become difficult to predict. I'd rather not. It's messy and it's disproportionate and frankly, it's beneath the level of operation I've been running. But I am prepared to create uncertainty, Nathaniel, and uncertainty at this scale and in this environment has consequences that I don't have to personally direct." He was watching her hands. Her right hand, specifically. The device. The distance. He was also watching the stage exit, where Ewan and the man in the catering uniform had been locked in a physical struggle for the last 90 seconds and where, from the quality of sound coming from that direction, the struggle was resolving itself, though he couldn't see how. His phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He didn't look at it. Solano said, "Don't." He said, "I'm not reaching for it." She said, "Good." He said, "Elena, you're smart enough to have gotten this far. Be smart enough to understand what this far means. You're in a room with 200 witnesses. You're identified. Your assets are identified. The federal case file on the syndicate's inner operations has your name in it going back 4 years. There is no version of this morning where you sign documents and walk away. The documents wouldn't be enforceable, signed under duress in a building full of witnesses. You know that." She said, "I know the documents aren't the point." He said, "Then what's the point?" She said, "The point is that you drove here this morning to get your son back, and I want you to understand completely and permanently what it costs when someone takes something from you, and there's nothing your money and your organization and your name can do about it. I want you to have that knowledge. The way your wife had it, standing at your gate for 2 hours. The way your son had it, growing up without a father. I want you to feel what it is to be helpless inside something that someone else is running." The gymnasium was very quiet. Nathaniel felt something settle in him. Not calm. It wasn't calm. It was older and simpler than calm. It was the thing underneath all the management and the strategy and the 15 years of building systems that controlled outcomes. It was the thing you got to when everything else was stripped away. He didn't have a name for it. He'd felt it twice before in his life. Once in Baltimore in a parking garage, and once on a night in New Orleans that he didn't think about anymore. The thing that wasn't peace and wasn't rage, but sat between them, very still, and knew exactly what the next few seconds required. He said, "You want me to know what helpless feels like?" She said, "Yes." He said, "All right." He took his jacket off. It was such an unexpected gesture that Solano's hand tightened on the device reflexively, her weight shifting, a micro-rebalancing of her stance. He moved without rush. He folded the jacket over his left arm, and as he did, he pressed the inside pocket to his chest for just a moment, the photograph. And then he held the jacket out to his right side and let it drop to the gymnasium floor. He said, "I've been managing distance from everything that mattered for 20 years. running things from behind systems and structures and people I thought I could trust. I don't have any of that right now. I don't have the organization behind me. I don't have the money or the name working for me in this room. I have two men, one of whom is currently occupied, and a federal operation that I've been told not to interfere with. He took one more step toward her. She said, "Stop." He didn't stop. She said, "Nathaniel." He said, "This is what it feels like when you've got nothing left to manage. When you're just a person in a room and the only thing that matters is the 9-year-old kid standing behind you." He was 10 feet from her now, close enough to see the calculation happening in her eyes. The rapid assessment of distance, device range, response options, the federal assets she knew were in the room and didn't know exactly where. Close enough to see the first hairline crack in the controlled surface she'd maintained across 3 years of patient, methodical destruction of his family. She said, "You are not going to—" The gymnasium door on the east wall came open hard, fast, and two of Reyes's people came through in the compressed, efficient movement of people who have been waiting for a cue, and Solano's head turned by instinct, just a fraction, just a half second, and Nathaniel closed the remaining distance. He got his hand on the device before she recovered. What followed was not elegant. It was close and it was physical, and Solano was not untrained. She was 50 and compact, and she fought the way people fight when they've anticipated the possibility of losing and have decided in advance not to accept it. She drove her elbow into his ribs with enough force that he felt something give, not break, but flex in a way that sent a white spike of pain up through his left side and made his breath come wrong for a moment. He kept his grip on the device. He drove his shoulder into her and used his weight, which was more than hers, and she went back into the table behind her, and the table went over, and they went with it and hit the gymnasium floor together in a collision that scattered chairs and sent a sound through the room that made children cry. He pinned her right arm. He pried the device from her hand. She tried to roll, and he didn't let her, his knee on the floor beside her, his weight forward. And then Reyes's people were there, and it was over. It was over in the way that these things end, suddenly and completely, the way a power cut ends a room's noise. He got up slowly. His ribs protested every inch of the motion. He straightened. He was breathing hard. Not the controlled breathing of a man managing a situation, but the raw physical breathing of a man who has just done something with his body and is paying for it. He had a cut on his right palm from something on the gymnasium floor. He hadn't felt it happen, and he noticed it now with the detached observation of someone whose attention is elsewhere. He turned. Ethan was still at the table, still standing. Charlotte was beside him now. She'd covered the 15 feet while the confrontation was happening, her arm around her son's shoulders, the two of them watching. Ethan was looking at Nathaniel, not with the blankness of before. Something had shifted in the boy's face, some recalibration that Nathaniel couldn't fully read, but which looked, in its raw form, before Ethan had time to process it into anything more composed, like the face of someone who has just watched a person do something that cost them something real, and is still working out what that means. Charlotte said, "Are you hurt?" Nathaniel said, "I'm fine." She looked at his hand. He looked at his hand. Blood from the cut was running across his palm in a thin line and dripping from his middle finger onto the gymnasium floor. He said, "I'm fine." She said, "Nathaniel." He said, "Is he okay?" She looked down at Ethan. She said, "Are you okay?" Ethan said, with the precise literalness of a 9-year-old processing an extraordinary morning, "I don't know yet." From across the gymnasium, Rhea's voice cut through the settling chaos with the particular flat authority of federal identification, directing people toward exits, instructing parents to stay with their children, communicating to the room that the situation was contained and that everyone should move calmly. Solano was in handcuffs on the floor. Two of Reyes's assets were working the stage exit. Somewhere outside, Croft had done what he was told, and the east side was being managed. Nathaniel stood in the middle of the gymnasium with blood running off his hand and his ribs sending a steady argument up through his left side and the sounds of a federal containment operation working around him. And he looked at his son, 9 years old. Backpack on the floor beside him. A name tag on his jacket that said Ethan in marker, slightly crooked because he'd put it on himself. He had Charlotte's jaw and Nathaniel's eyes, and 3 years of a story that had been told to him without the chapter Nathaniel now needed to add. And he was looking back at his father with the careful, measuring look of a child who has learned not to extend trust before he has sufficient evidence. Nathaniel understood that look. He had no argument against it. The look was accurate. He opened his mouth to say something, and then Reyes was beside him, her hand on his arm, her voice low and operational. "I need you to come with me. Outside. Now. I have Webb and Solano and Harmon, and I need you on record before the scene gets any more complicated." He said, "Give me a minute." She said, "Nathaniel." He said, 60 seconds, Reyes." She looked at him. Then she looked at the boy. Then she stepped back. He crouched down. He was 6 feet from Ethan, and he went to one knee on the gymnasium floor so that the height difference between them was gone, so that they were level eye to eye. And up close, his son's face was more familiar than it had been from across the room. There were things in it that Nathaniel recognized the way you recognize your own handwriting in something you don't remember writing. He said, "I know you don't know me." Ethan said nothing. He said, "I know that the story you have about why I wasn't there is probably not wrong, exactly. I made choices that cost your mother and you something real. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that's not true, but there were also things that happened that I didn't know about and that I've been trying to undo for a long time. Both of those things are true at the same time, and I understand that's complicated." Ethan said, "Mom said you were busy." The word landed. 3 years of a mother explaining absence to a child with the most charitable available word. Busy. Not gone. Not wouldn't. Busy. He said, "She was being kind." Ethan considered this. He said, "Were you?" He said, "Busy?" Ethan said, "Kind." Nathaniel looked at his son. The gymnasium was loud with the organized noise of containment and a room of frightened people being guided toward calm. And in the middle of all of it, his 9-year-old son had just asked him the most accurate question anyone had put to him in 20 years of answering questions from dangerous people in high-stakes rooms. He said, "Not enough. Not nearly enough." Ethan looked at him for a long time. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and his hand moved around inside it like he was looking for something. And then he stopped, and something moved through his face that Nathaniel couldn't fully read, but that looked from the outside like a child deciding something. He said, "I had something for you. I kept it for a long time." Nathaniel said, "I know." Ethan looked up. Something sharpened in his expression. He said, "How do you know?" Nathaniel said, "Your mother told me about it. It wasn't true. But the alternative was, because I've been carrying a photograph of you across my chest for 6 weeks and thinking about that drawing every day for 3 years. And that was too much to put on a 9-year-old in a gymnasium that still smelled like fear and floor wax." The lie was a small mercy, and he made it without hesitation, and he told himself he'd replace it with the truth later, when later was a thing they had. Reyes touched his arm again. He looked up at her. She said quietly, "I really need you now." He stood. His ribs fired again, the white spike, and he kept it off his face. He looked at Charlotte over Ethan's head, and she was watching him with the same careful measuring quality that Ethan had, the same learned caution. And he understood that the morning had changed something but hadn't resolved anything, that what he'd done in this gymnasium was necessary but was not the same as sufficient, and sufficient was going to take longer and cost more, and require a version of him that he hadn't fully built yet. He said to Charlotte, "I'll be outside." She said, "Okay." He said, "Don't leave before I come back." She looked at him. A long moment. Then she said, "Okay." He followed Reyes toward the gymnasium door. Behind him, he could hear Ethan say something to Charlotte in a low voice, and Charlotte respond. And then Ethan said something else, and this time his voice was slightly different in quality. Uncertain, maybe, or moving toward something. And Nathaniel didn't turn around because turning around would have unmade him completely, and he needed to hold himself together for 20 more minutes while Reyes put her case together and the federal operation closed its final doors. Outside the gymnasium, in the corridor with the noise muffled behind the closed door, Reyes said, "She had 4 people outside the building. 2 are in custody, 2 ran, and we'll have them within the hour." He said, "Marcus Webb." She said, "East stairwell. He surrendered without incident when we moved on him." She said this with a specific neutrality that meant she understood what it cost him to hear it. Webb, surrendering without incident, the flat cowardice of a man who had been willing to destroy a family from a distance but didn't have the architecture for confrontation. He said, "I want to be in the room when you talk to him." She said, "That's not—" He said, "Reyes." She looked at him. She said, "You understand I am doing you an enormous number of professional courtesies this morning." He said, "I know." She said, "And you understand that at some point in the relatively near future, those courtesies are going to come with a conversation about the Sterling Syndicate's operational history that is going to be long and detailed and conducted in a formal setting." He said, "I know that too." She said, "And you're prepared for that." He said, "I've been prepared for that for 6 weeks." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Webb is in a room upstairs. You get 5 minutes, and I'm in the room with you, and you don't touch him." He said, "I don't need to touch him." She said, "I know you don't. I'm saying it anyway." They went upstairs. The second floor was quiet. Administrative offices closed, the family day event having concentrated everything below. 2 of Reyes's people were outside a closed door at the end of the hallway. One of them nodded at Reyes and opened the door. Marcus Webb was sitting at an administrator's desk with his hands on the table and the particular quality of stillness that men acquire when they understand that movement is no longer an option. He looked up when Nathaniel came in. Something moved through his face, something that might have been shame or might have been the expression shame puts on when shame can't find its way to the surface through 15 years of professional remove. Nathaniel stood across the table from him. He didn't sit. He looked at Marcus Webb for a long time without speaking, and Webb held the look, which was the bravest thing he'd done all morning, and probably the most honest. Then Nathaniel said, "She waited 2 hours." Webb said nothing. He said, "Charlotte, she stood at the gate with our 6-year-old son and she waited 2 hours, and you told your people to turn her away." Webb said, "It was—" He said, "Don't." Webb closed his mouth. He said, 15 years, Marcus. I'm not asking you to explain it to me. I'm not looking for a reason that makes it make sense. I'm telling you what you did, and I'm telling you that I know, and that's all I need from this room." Webb looked at his hands. He said, "Solano came to me 18 months in, said the window was opening, said the family separation was already in place, and the longer it held, the more leverage it built. I told myself it was operational. That sentiment was," he said, "stop." Webb stopped. He said, "Is there anything in the world you could say in the next 4 minutes that would matter?" Webb looked up. He said, "No." Nathaniel said, "Then don't use the 4 minutes." He turned around. Reyes was by the door watching him. He walked toward her and she moved aside, and he went out into the corridor and she came after him and pulled the door closed, and they stood in the quiet hallway, and he put his back against the wall and breathed. His ribs, the cut on his hand, the specific exhaustion of a morning that had started at 4:15 a.m. and had required him to be continuously something he wasn't certain he had enough of left. Reyes said, "Go back to your family." He said, "I'm not." She said, "Nathaniel, the operational phase is complete. I have what I need. Go back to your family." He looked at her. She was 43, precise, tired around the eyes in a way that meant the 8 months of building this case had cost her something personal. She'd done him courtesies this morning that her supervisor would want to discuss. He owed her more than he'd be able to repay in the formal setting that was coming, and she knew it, and she was telling him anyway to go. He said, "Thank you." She said, "Don't thank me yet." He walked back down the hallway. Behind him, the federal operation continued doing what federal operations do: documenting, containing, building the record that would become, in the months ahead, the formal accounting of what the Sterling Syndicate had been and done, and what its principals had known and when. His name was in that record. He had put it there himself 6 weeks ago when he called Reyes from an empty estate and made the only trade he had left to make. He went down the stairs. He went back through the corridor toward the gymnasium. The school was quieter now, parents in clusters, children with that wide-eyed post-adrenaline quality of people who have been frightened and are now in the processing phase, teachers doing the quiet, heroic work of keeping things functional around the edges of something that had no place in a school hallway. He pushed through the gymnasium door. Charlotte and Ethan were where he'd left them. Charlotte was sitting at the table now, Ethan beside her. and they were talking in the low voices of two people who have been talking about something important and have reached a pause that isn't finished but is resting. They both looked up when he came in. He walked toward them, his ribs with every step, his hand still bleeding, slower now, but still. He walked across the gymnasium floor with the morning's full weight in his body and stopped at the table and looked at his son, and his son looked back at him. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket. He moved his hand around inside it for a moment, searching. Then he went into the front pouch of his backpack on the floor, and then he sat up with something in his hand, folded paper, creased and soft in the way that paper gets when it's been handled many times, folded and refolded along the same lines until the creases are nearly worn through. He held it in both hands and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked up at Nathaniel. He said, "I kept it." Nathaniel sat down across from his son. His voice, when he found it, was not entirely steady. He said, "I know you kept it." Ethan looked at him across the table with those eyes that were his own eyes in someone else's face, and the folded paper sat between them on the gymnasium table like a thing that had been waiting a long time to stop waiting. The boy didn't hand it over. Not yet. He held it in both hands and looked at it, and Nathaniel understood that the holding was part of something, that Ethan was doing the internal work that 9-year-olds do when they're deciding something that their vocabulary isn't large enough to name, but their instincts are large enough to feel. Charlotte watched from beside her son. She didn't speak. She'd learned in 3 years of raising him alone when to let Ethan arrive at his own places in his own time, and she applied that knowledge now, even though the effort of applying it was visible in the set of her shoulders and the way her hands were flat on the table, very still. The gymnasium was continuing to empty around them. Reyes's people were moving people through the exits with the patient efficiency of professionals who understood that 200 civilians needed to be cleared and documented before the scene could be formally processed. A teacher near the far wall was sitting with a group of young children, keeping them calm with a quiet, continuous narrative that Nathaniel couldn't hear from across the room, but could see working. The children's faces, moving from wide-eyed alarm back towards something approaching ordinary. That teacher, he thought, had done something genuinely hard this morning and would probably not be recognized for it in any formal way. That seemed like one of the more accurate things in the world. His ribs were sending a steady report up through his left side. The cut on his hand had slowed. Somewhere above him, on the second floor of this building, Marcus Webb was sitting with his hands on a table and the understanding of what the next years of his life were going to look like. Somewhere in a federal vehicle outside, Elena Solano was being processed with the particular flat efficiency that the system applies to people who have been patient and methodical and have ultimately miscalculated the thing that patient and methodical people most often miscalculate. The variable they couldn't control because it wasn't organizational or structural or financial, it was personal. And personal things don't behave like operations, no matter how long you manage them like one. She had managed his family like an operation for 3 years, and it had failed because at some fundamental level, a family is not an operation. A family is 2 people in a car after a party and a child on the back seat with a drawing he didn't get to deliver. A family is a woman standing at a gate for 2 hours because she came back. A family is a 9-year-old boy who kept a piece of paper in his jacket pocket for 3 years and brought it to a school event because some part of him that didn't have language yet understood that the event was important in a way the invitation didn't fully explain. Ethan looked up from the drawing. He said, "You left?" Nathaniel said, "Yes." He said, "You left a lot, even before." Nathaniel said, "Yes." He said, "Mom said you had work." Nathaniel said, "I did have work." That's true. It's also not the whole truth. Ethan considered this. The gymnasium noise moved around them, quieter now, thinning. He said, "What's the whole truth?" Nathaniel looked at his son. He thought about the various ways a man can answer that question. The managed versions, the shaped versions, the versions that are technically accurate and emotionally evasive, the versions he'd been composing in his head for 3 years against the possibility of exactly this moment. Then he set all of them aside. He said, "I built something that I kept telling myself was for our family because that was easier than admitting I was building it for myself. Because it made me feel like I was in control of something. And while I was building it, I was absent. And being absent became a habit. And habits are hard to see when you're inside them. And by the time I understood what I'd done, your mother had made a decision, and I had given her every reason to make it. And I spent a long time after that telling myself it was her choice, that she left, because that was easier than understanding that I had been leaving for years before she did. The gymnasium was quiet enough now that his voice was the loudest thing in their corner of it. Ethan was watching him with an attention that was not childlike in any of the usual diminutive ways. It was the attention of someone who has been thinking about an absence for a long time and is now hearing it described from the inside for the first time. He said, "Did you look for us?" Nathaniel said, "Yes." He said, "For how long?" Nathaniel said, "From the beginning. And then I stopped for a while because I couldn't find you, and then I started again, and this time I didn't stop." He said, "Why did you stop?" The question was not accusatory. It was genuinely curious, the way children are genuinely curious about the mechanics of failure, because children haven't yet learned to treat failure as something shameful that should be alleged in the telling. Nathaniel felt the question go all the way in. He said, "Because I was ashamed, and ashamed people find reasons to stop doing hard things." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's not a good reason." Nathaniel said, "No, it's not." He said, "Okay, not forgiveness, not absolution." Okay, the word a 9-year-old uses when he has received information and is filing it somewhere and is not yet ready to tell you what he's going to do with it. It was the most honest response available, and Nathaniel recognized it as such, and didn't try to convert it into something warmer. Then Ethan slid the folded paper across the table. He didn't say anything. He pushed it from his side of the table to Nathaniel's side with 2 fingers, carefully, the way you move something fragile, and then he pulled his hand back and put it in his lap and looked at a point on the table between them. Nathaniel looked at the paper. The folds were worn almost to transparency at the creases. The paper itself had the soft, matte quality of something that had been handled often, carried close, taken out, and put back many times over 3 years. He thought about a small suit jacket with an inside pocket. He thought about a backpack and a school event, and a boy who had kept this thing through 3 years of a story that didn't have him in it, kept it the way you keep something you're not ready to let become only a memory. He unfolded it. The drawing was in colored pencil, faded but legible. 3 figures under a yellow sun. The sun had lines radiating outward, the child's shorthand for warmth that is the same in every language. The figure on the left was small, with a large head and stick arms that held something, a book maybe, or a bag. It was hard to tell. The figure in the center was taller, with longer hair rendered in careful strokes of brown, and on the right, taller than both, with what appeared to be a suit jacket suggested in 2 dark vertical lines, a space. Not empty exactly, but held open, deliberately unconstructed, as if the 6-year-old hand had known exactly what it was drawing around. At the bottom, in block letters that had the particular determined quality of a child who is learning to form letters and is applying full concentration to each one. Dad, I saved you a place next to us. Nathaniel sat at a gymnasium table in Brookline, Massachusetts, with a cut on his hand and cracked ribs, and 3 years of an empire that was currently being documented by federal investigators. And he looked at those words, and he did not cry in the way that dramatic moments in stories require their characters to cry. What happened was quieter and more total than that, a kind of internal structural shift, like a building settling after a long period of stress, the sound of something that has been braced against collapse finally being allowed to find its natural position. He held the drawing for a long time. Charlotte said, quietly, "He's carried it since the night of the gala." Nathaniel looked up. She said, "I found it in his room about a year after we left. I asked him about it, and he said he was keeping it for when he needed it." He said, "When did he decide he needed it today?" She looked at Ethan. Ethan was looking at the table. She said, "Last night, when I told him you'd be here, he went and got it from his drawer and put it in his pocket. He didn't explain why, and I didn't ask." Nathaniel looked at his son. Ethan didn't look up immediately. When he did, finally, his expression had the careful quality of someone who has done something that required more courage than they'd expected, and is now in the slightly exposed place that courage leaves you in after you've spent it. Nathaniel said, "Thank you for keeping it." Ethan said, "I almost threw it away once." He said, "When?" He said, "Like a year ago. I was mad." He said, "You had every right to be mad." He said, I know, but I didn't throw it away. He said, I know. I can see that you didn't. Ethan looked at him for a moment. Then something in his face shifted. Not resolved, not repaired, but moved, the way ground moves in the early stages of something slow and geological that will take a long time to complete. He said, Your hand is bleeding. Nathaniel looked at his hand. The cut had opened again slightly, a thin red line across his palm. He said, I know. Ethan said, Mom has bandages in her bag. She always has bandages. Charlotte said, with a dryness that was entirely her own, and that Nathaniel recognized from 8 years of marriage like a key fitting a lock, because someone is frequently in need of them, and it's not me. She was looking at Nathaniel when she said it. There was something in the look that was not yet warm but was not cold either. It was the look of a woman who has spent 3 years building a careful self-sufficiency and is now sitting in a gymnasium across from the reason she needed it, and is finding that the feelings she thought she'd organized into something manageable are in fact not organized at all. They are simply present, complicated, and simultaneous. The way real feelings are when they don't have the decency to arrive one at a time. She opened her bag. She found a small fabric case and took out 2 adhesive bandages and slid them across the table. He picked them up. He tried to apply the first one to his own right hand using only his left, and the geometry was wrong, and he couldn't get the backing off cleanly. He was working at it with the particular silent frustration of someone who is not going to ask for help when Ethan reached across the table and took the bandage from him. He said, I can do it. He peeled the backing off with the focused competence of a child who has been patched up enough times to know the process, and he smoothed the bandage across the cut on his father's palm with both thumbs, pressing the edges down. His hands were small and certain and warm. He did the second one the same way, overlapping slightly to cover the full length of the cut, and then he sat back. He examined his work. He said, That's okay. Nathaniel said, Yeah, that's okay. The word landed differently in his mouth than it had in Ethan's. He let it. Reyes appeared at the gymnasium door. She looked at the 3 of them at the table and made a small gesture at Nathaniel. Not urgent, not commanding, just indicating that the outside world had needs and would require his attention within a finite time. He nodded at her. She withdrew. He looked at Charlotte. He said, I need to go and deal with some things, federal things. It's going to take some time. She said, I know. He said, After that, there's a conversation we need to have that I can't have in this building. She said, I know that too. He said, Charlotte, what they told you at the gate. She said, I know. You told me. He said, I need you to know that She said, Nathaniel. She said it with a quality of patience that was entirely different from the patience of 3 years ago. This was not the patience of someone who is waiting for a man to become something. It was the patience of someone who has long since stopped waiting and is now simply deciding, in real time, what she actually wants. She said, I believe you didn't know. I'm going to need more than one conversation to know what I want to do with that. He said, I understand. She said, Do you? He said, I think so. I think it means I don't get to decide the pace of this. She looked at him. The look was long and examining, and he held it without managing it, without the slight repositioning that powerful men do when they are being evaluated. He just held it and let her see what was there, which was considerable and not all of it flattering. She said, No, you don't get to decide the pace. He said, Okay. He stood. His ribs. He didn't let it show, started to not let it show, out of habit, and then stopped, and let the slight catch in his movement be visible because managing his body language for Charlotte's benefit was exactly the wrong direction. She saw it. She said, How bad? He said, Not broken. Probably. She said, You should get it looked at. He said, I will. He picked up the drawing from the table. He looked at Ethan. He said, Can I keep this for now? I'll give it back. Ethan thought about it seriously, the way children think about the disposition of their things. Then he said, You can keep it. You don't have to give it back. He said, You sure? Ethan said, I made it for you. It was always yours. Nathaniel folded the drawing carefully along its original creases and put it in his jacket pocket, over his chest, where the photograph had been. The photograph he transferred to his other pocket because they were different things, and both needed to be carried. He said, "I'll find you after." He meant it as a practical statement, after the federal debrief, after the documentation, after the formal beginning of the accounting that was coming. Charlotte understood it that way and nodded. But Ethan took it at a different register, a larger one, and said, "Promise?" Nathaniel looked at his son. He said, "Yes." He walked out of the gymnasium. What followed was not clean. Nothing about the next several months was clean, and he hadn't expected it to be. The formal debrief with Reyes lasted 11 hours, 2 separate sessions, in a federal facility in Boston, where he sat across a table from 3 people with recording equipment and legal counsel present and answered questions about the Sterling Syndicate's operational history with the comprehensive honesty of a man who has decided that the thing he is dismantling is not worth protecting at the cost of what he is trying to build. It was an exhausting and demeaning and necessary process, and he went through it without maneuvering, without the strategic evasions he could have constructed, because the point was not to minimize his exposure, the point was to be done. The case against Solano, Webb, and Harmon was built from 3 directions simultaneously. The federal investigation that Reyes had been running for 8 months, the operational intelligence Nathaniel provided, and the digital trail that Solano's communications infrastructure had generated over 3 years, which turned out to be extensive and meticulous in the way that records kept by someone who expects to be in control of them forever tend to be. Solano had documented everything, every instruction to the gate security, every order to redirect the investigations Nathaniel had funded, every contact with the private surveillance teams. She had kept records because she'd planned to keep the organization, and the records were the organization's history, and those records were now the federal case's primary exhibit. At the arraignment, which Nathaniel did not attend, but which Reyes described to him afterward with the flat economy of a person delivering operational information, Solano had looked at the evidence file and said nothing for 40 seconds. Then she'd asked her attorney for a recess. She pleaded guilty 8 weeks later. Webb and Harmon followed within the month. Sterling Global Holdings entered a formal restructuring process in November. Nathaniel worked with federal oversight and a compliance team to separate the legitimate operations from the structures that had served the syndicate's less documentable interests. 12 companies were unwound, 4 were sold, 3 were transferred to independent management with new governance structures. What remained was smaller and less impressive and entirely legal, and he found, in the process of dismantling what he'd built, that he was more interested in the rebuilding than he'd expected to be. Not the rebuilding of scale, but of something different, a version of operation that didn't require the management of secrets as a structural component. It took a long time. The legal process was not fast, and the compliance process was not fast, and the personal process was not fast either, and he didn't try to make any of them fast because speed had been his primary error across 20 years, and he was done optimizing for it. He rented an apartment in Cambridge, Massachusetts, 40 minutes from Somerville on foot, less by car. He didn't move in next door. He didn't reappear at the school. He called Charlotte once a week, not to negotiate, not to propose anything, just to talk. About Ethan and about logistics, and occasionally about other things. The ordinary currency of 2 people relearning each other's conversational rhythms after a long absence. Some weeks the calls were short. Some weeks they lasted an hour. He let her determine the length. He saw Ethan for the first time in a formal context 6 weeks after the gymnasium, a Saturday afternoon at a public ice skating rink that Charlotte had suggested because it was neutral and loud and provided a continuous activity that meant silences didn't have to be filled. He didn't know how to skate. This turned out to be useful. Ethan, who had been learning for 2 years and was competent in the unself-conscious way of children who learn physical skills before they have time to develop the self-consciousness that makes adults learn them badly, spent 40 minutes teaching his father to move around the ice without falling, and the specific transactional pleasure of teaching someone something useful was, Nathaniel observed, doing more work in those 40 minutes than any conversation could have. He fell twice. The second time he went down on the same side as the injured ribs and came up with his teeth set, and Ethan, who had circled back when he heard the sound of the fall, said, "Are you okay?" And Nathaniel said, from the ice, "I'm learning," and Ethan said, "It's the same thing," and pushed off and skated away with the ease of someone who has already learned what they're teaching and is now simply waiting at the other end for the student to arrive. He did not take that moment and make it into something it wasn't. He got up and kept skating. The months had a rhythm. The legal process, the restructuring, the weekly calls that became longer, the Saturdays that became a pattern, not guaranteed, not assumed, but present more often than not, a loose, consistent thread. He did not rush the thread. He let it be what it was. Some Saturdays Ethan was talkative, and some Saturdays he was interior and remote, in the way that children are when something at school or in their inner life is taking up space. And Nathaniel learns to be useful in both modes without requiring the version he found easier. Charlotte came to 3 of the Saturdays. She stayed for part of 2 of them. She was civil in a way that was also honest. Not warm exactly, but not cold. The temperature of something that is deciding, slowly, what it wants to be when it finishes deciding. He didn't try to accelerate the decision. He had learned, finally, and at considerable cost, that some things don't accelerate. In February, 8 months after the gymnasium, on a Saturday afternoon in the parking lot of a skating rink, while Ethan was returning the rental skates inside, Charlotte said, "I've been thinking about the gate." He said, "Okay." She said, "I've been thinking that I was angry about it for a long time as a thing that you did. And then you told me it wasn't you, and I believed you, which shifted the anger somewhere else. And then I was angry at Webb, and at Solano, and at the whole structure of it. And then I was tired of being angry at the specific people, and I was left with just the anger itself, without a target." He said, "I know that feeling." She said, "I'm not done being angry." He said, "I know." She said, "But I'm tired of it being the main thing." He said nothing. He understood that this was not the moment for language, that whatever she was moving toward was moving there on its own, and his job was to not interrupt it. She said, "Ethan asks about you now, during the week. He didn't used to do that." He said, "What does he ask?" She said, "Whether you're coming on Saturday, whether you've called. Last week he asked if you were going to stay in Cambridge. He said, 'What did you tell him?' She said, 'I said I didn't know.' He said, 'That was honest.' She said, 'Yes.'" A pause. The parking lot around them was ordinary. Cars, cold air, a family loading into a minivan at the far end, children arguing about something that wasn't resolvable and would be forgotten by dinner. Charlotte had her hands in her coat pockets and was looking at the middle distance, the way she looked when she was thinking rather than feeling. And then she turned and looked at him directly. She said, "I need you to understand something. If this continues, whatever this is, it won't be what it was before. I'm not the person I was before, and you're not either, and Ethan is not 6 anymore, and none of us can go back to a version that existed before the gala and before the gate and before 3 years." He said, "I know." She said, "I mean it." He said, "Charlotte, I know. I'm not trying to go back. I don't think that exists." She said, "Then what are you trying to do?" He thought about it. He said, "I'm trying to be the person who shows up. That's the whole of it. I'm not trying to rebuild anything specific. I'm just trying to be present in a way that's real and consistent and that Ethan can rely on. And whatever comes from that comes from that." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "That's the most honest thing you've said to me since the gala." He said, "I've had 8 months of practice at honest." She said, with the dryness he'd been hearing more often recently, returning in small ways like a season. "Federal oversight will do that to a person." He said, "It really will." A ghost of something moved through her face. Not quite a smile. The place where a smile might grow if given sufficient time and reason. She looked away again, back toward the rink entrance where Ethan would emerge in a few minutes with his regular shoes and the particular post-skating energy of a child who has been in motion and is not finished with motion. She said, "He found a framed space in his room, on the wall beside the window. He's been planning to hang something there." Nathaniel said nothing. She said, "He hasn't hung anything yet. He said he's waiting for the right thing." The wind moved through the parking lot. Nathaniel felt it on his face, cold and without sentiment, the February wind of a Massachusetts afternoon that does not care about the specific human weight of any given moment. He thought about a drawing on a gymnasium table, folded along worn creases. He thought about a space on a wall beside a window, deliberately left empty, a 9-year-old's version of saving a place. He said, "I have something that might work." She said, "I thought you might." She turned and walked toward the rink entrance. At the door, she stopped and looked back at him, and this time the expression on her face was clear enough to read, not resolved, not arrived, but pointed in a direction that was not away from him, which was different from where it had been for a long time, and which was, he understood, the most honest thing available. She went inside. He stood in the parking lot and breathed the cold air and felt his ribs, which had healed mostly but registered certain movements still, and thought about the drawing in his jacket pocket, which was in the inside pocket where it had been since the gymnasium, warm from being carried. He thought about the photograph that was in the other pocket, also warm, because things you carry close to you eventually take on the temperature of your body. He thought about what Charlotte had said. Whatever comes from that comes from that. He thought it was the most accurate description of a future he'd ever been offered. Not a promise, and not a plan, and not an empire. Just the natural consequence of showing up, consistently, and letting the showing up be enough. Ethan came through the rink door with his shoes in one hand and his coat half zipped and his backpack over one shoulder. And that look he carried, the slightly distracted look of a kid whose mind was running ahead to something the rest of him hadn't caught up to yet. He saw Nathaniel in the parking lot and lifted his chin in the greeting of a 9-year-old who has decided that a chin lift is the appropriate greeting for the current status of a relationship that doesn't have a clean name yet and doesn't need one. Nathaniel lifted his chin back. Ethan came across the parking lot and fell into step beside him, and they walked toward Charlotte's car where she was waiting, and the three of them stood briefly in the cold February air beside an ordinary vehicle in an ordinary parking lot, while Ethan argued with his coat zipper, and Charlotte found her keys and the afternoon moved on around them the way afternoons do, without ceremony, without announcement, one moment following the next in the simple consecutive way of things that are actually happening rather than things that are being managed into happening. There was nothing historic about the moment. There was nothing that a photographer would have found worth capturing. It was a parking lot. It was cold. It was a man standing beside a woman and a child, all three of them imperfect and altered and carrying the specific weight of what they'd been through. None of them pretending it was lighter than it was. It was real. That was the whole of it. After 20 years of building things that were designed to look like something, after 3 years of loss that had no design and no management and no outcome he could predict, this was what remained. A parking lot, a coat zipper that wouldn't cooperate, a child who would carry a drawing upstairs tonight and find the frame space on his wall and decide that the empty space had waited long enough. Nathaniel put his hand briefly on Ethan's shoulder. Not a correction, not direction, just contact. The way Charlotte had done it at the rink entrance 8 months ago, the way he'd watched and understood and filed away as the thing he wanted to learn to do, the casual physical reassurance of long familiarity, the thing you can't fake and can't rush, that comes only from being present enough times that your presence stops being an event and becomes instead a steady, ordinary fact of someone's life. Ethan didn't pull away. That was enough. That was, in the February cold of a parking lot in Massachusetts, with a legal process still running, and a restructured company, and a federal file with his name in it, and a drawing in his inside pocket, and 2 repaired ribs and a relationship that was still deciding what it wanted to be, everything. Nathaniel Sterling, who had built an empire out of the management of outcomes, stood in a parking lot and let the outcome be whatever it was. The wind moved through. The afternoon went on.